ST, Taos in Baltimore. Here I fear over the next couple of weeks, and certainly with the Orioles limping here to the finish line, I am going to begin this next segment, with my dear friend from the Great White North of Toronto, Canada, up there in Ontario. He covers the National Football League for Bleacher Report, but he is an uncloseted Toronto Blue Jays fan who has many times jumped up and down and screamed, and certainly did after Zach Britton sat on the edge of the bench up there at Skydome these 11 months ago. But we welcome Brad back on to talk some football, and we'll get to that in a minute. But while the Orioles spent the beginning part of the week up in Toronto watching their season circle the drain, I just want to say, from one guy not in the playoffs to another guy not in the playoffs, it sucks. It was a lot more fun the last couple of years, wasn't it?
It was so fun, and in Toronto's case, it was basically a quarter century in the waiting. So it almost became spoiled the last couple of years, and it's probably better for my job because my focus level at times on an NFL Sunday when the Blue Jays were playing a big game in September and October, off and waned. I got it done, Nestor, but it's almost the one thing I'm noticing. I'm like, well, I seem like I'm not as distracted. Oh yeah, that's why the Blue Jays aren't quite as aren't monopolizing my time quite as much as usual, because it isn't appointment viewing like it is. I mean, I've been watching the Blue Jays pretty much on a nightly basis for a quarter century myself, but regardless, it's not quite the same commitment level. As you know, the whole city gets behind a team when they're on a playoff push like that, especially in Toronto. It's a little disappointing to see some of the crowds in Baltimore when they were still kind of alive there, last couple of weeks. And then, of course, they hit that skid. And now, like you say, it's over for both of us. So, it's hopefully they bounce back next year. I do always find a bit of a camaraderie to an extent with Baltimore fans, despite the fact there's a rivalry between the Jays and Orioles the last few years, especially. I always do feel like both fans are coming from the same spot. They're both really hungry, and we all really, really, really can't stand the Yankees and Red Sox. So
exactly. I mean, I can't even hate on these poor Cleveland people. I mean, the Indians beat the snot out of us over the weekend. Let them go win the thing. I don't want to see any more parades up and down Broadway, any more boat rides with freaking ducks in Boston. I'm done with all that. So let Cleveland win. Let Houston win. Let somebody else do it, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's where I am. I mean, I would take Cleveland or Baltimore. Teams like that.
I'm pulling from Minnesota, by the way. I mean, I got a little Twins thing. Let them go to New York and try to beat the Yankees in one game, right?
That'd be awesome. Just like the team that I always had in the early part of this century, I guess it would be technically, is the Athletics. The Moneyball A's, and you always kind of pulled for them to take down the Yankees when they met them in those playoff series, and so that's kind of the modern day this era's comparison is the Indians. It would be nice to see that they came so close last year, but the Cubs are a great story anyway. So maybe this is their year. Obviously, right now they're playing as good as baseball as any team in the last century. I mean they're on fire. So.
Well, and then there's football season coming right on in while the Orioles go into Cleveland and get swept and have the season sort of abruptly come to a halt over the weekend. And this is where you step in. Brad Gagnon covers all things NFL for Bleacher Report up there in Toronto, and I know you're monitoring all the games. There were some impressive things that happened in week one. Clearly, Kansas City was impressive. The Patriots losing is a huge story. The Giants kind of not showing up a little bit. Seahawks didn't look so good over the weekend either. But, boy, the Ravens look good, and maybe the Bengals are going to stink. Mm-hmm. But one thing we know about the Ravens is this defense looks like it's going to travel.
Yeah, and that defense really, I mean, we try not to read too much into preseason performances, but that defense really gave some indications in the preseason that it could be incredibly good this season. And when you go out in week one and you reaffirm that and you reinforce that, that's really, that sends a message right there. So, as long as some of those key cogs, Terrell Suggs, can stay healthy, it's easy to see this team resembling some of the great Baltimore Ravens teams we've seen in the last almost 2 decades now, which is kind of get by on the offensive side of the ball, and dominate on the defensive side of the ball. And Cincinnati letting a couple key offensive linemen walk, and then Andy Dalton being under constant pressure as a result of that to an extent. That's a factor. Dalton played a terrible game, and we do see bad Andy once in a while. They might not be as dominant in future weeks, just like, a lot of the extremes that took place this week, whether it be Minnesota's Sam Bradford performance or New England really struggling. Those things usually will come back a little bit to center in the coming weeks, of course, and Baltimore will too. But I do think the Ravens, sent a pretty clear message on Sunday that they're probably the number 2 in a division where it wasn't entirely clear who the number 2 was, and heck, maybe even the number 1. I mean, they were usually right there with Pittsburgh anyway, and the Steelers weren't exactly impressive against the Browns. So I think it's pretty clear at this point that Cincinnati and Cleveland are the bottom half, and Baltimore and Pittsburgh are the top half. And I'm excited to see what that defense can do going forward, regardless of the fact that there are still some major questions about that offense.
Well, and I think the division is still in check right now when the Steelers don't pull away from the Browns. I've talked to everybody in Cleveland; they were all very impressed with Kaiser. We'll see on Sunday.
Yeah, Cleveland is making steps in the right direction, and that's the thing. It's good. I think this division's kind of headed in a direction where it's going to be ultra competitive for many years to come. And I think the one team that I fear is in the biggest trouble are the Bengals. I think that they, if anything, have a rebuild ahead of them at some point soon, because I don't think Andy Dalton's a long-term option for them. I don't, he continually proves that he can't get it done in big spots and in big games and in divisional games, and they did take a big step backward this offseason, in my opinion. So I wonder if they're on the way down, Cleveland's on the way up. Baltimore continually is, you can't keep the Ravens down. A season or two, injuries, all these things that happen where, they're not always going to be right there. But, Baltimore always seems to bounce back real quick. And they've always had that defensive base in place for the most part. And when you throw in Joe Flacco, who at the very least, whatever you want to say about him, is an experienced veteran quarterback who has been there and done that in the playoffs, then you're going to have a shot. And again, I wonder about that offensive line that suffered some losses again in the offseason. I wonder about a running game that doesn't really have a clear-cut lead guy. And I wonder about a receiving core and a tight end core that underwent a lot of changes in the offseason and lost a couple key players, of course, in Dennis Pitta and Steve Smith. So, those are all concerns. And no team in the league is without those concerns. A week ago, I would have told you the New England Patriots were the one team, or at least maybe 2 weeks ago, were the one team without any of those concerns, and now you throw in the injuries that they've suffered. And it's just like nobody's perfect, and that's the one thing Baltimore is going to have to overcome this season. But they're absolutely, at this point in time, have to be considered a legitimate contender.
Brad, John Harbaugh likes to play smart football. He's the deep thinker and the evaluative guy, and a little bit of a healthy dose of paranoia, I might add, as well. But they ran the ball 42 times, and they passed the ball 17 times. They didn't turn the ball over but once. They created turnovers. I mean, all of the things you wanted. They graded the road in the third quarter on the road. Kept them down, pitched the shutout. All of that. Finish, all that stuff. But really the balance of 42 runs and 17 passes, if they can do that every week, and you only do that when you're ahead and you're taking the air out of the ball, whether it's at home or on the road, boy, that's a really, really nice little recipe if the defense is going to be a 3-and-out, take the ball away once a quarter kind of defense, because they certainly look to be that on Sunday.
Yeah, and their approach has to be particularly refreshing for Ravens fans. I think that's, one team that seems to, almost on a yearly basis, come under fire for lacking balance. And sometimes that's about your personnel. Oftentimes in Baltimore's history, that was about, in the last 5-6 years, was about the offensive coordinator and the system in place. And at this point in time, in this particular case, as you mentioned, it was the fact that they had a big lead. But regardless, it was tidy, and most teams want to win the way the Ravens won that game. Not just the score line and not just the fact they put up a goose egg on defense, but the fact that they only had to make their quarterback throw 17 passes. The fact that he only had 121 yards and they still won the game by 3 scores. I mean, that's rare. But, you're talking about a quarterback who missed the entire preseason due to an injury, one who has questions surrounding him. If you can limit his exposure to hits, limit the amount of times he has to drop back and throw the ball, you're doing good. You're doing something real good. And so, Buck Allen and Terrence West and Danny Woodhead now is hurt, but I mean, as long as they can get something on a weekly basis, or at least most weekly basis, you don't have to do this all 16. You're probably not going 16-0, but rather consistently, the way they did it on Sunday, you're going to win a lot of games, and you're going to stay relatively healthy. It really is the key to preserving yourself when you can win games the way they did on Sunday. And that again, is limiting what Joe Flacco did. You know, Jacksonville did the same thing with Blake Bortles. Different teams, of course, and I'm not comparing the two quarterbacks, but you know, Jacksonville has its concerns about its quarterback. They went out against Houston, played great defensively, ran the ball, put it all on Leonard Fournette, and gave Blake Bortles the easiest possible afternoon he could have, which limits potential injuries, limits potential exposure to problems, and that's exactly what Baltimore did. So, I mean, that's really the cleanest way to win, and I think it's just the most promising start you could possibly have if you're a football team right now.
Now, you mentioned Jacksonville, Brad, and we play them 2 weeks from now over in Wembley. And look, when you get a Jacksonville game, you got to feel like, you know, you play them on the lunar surface. You should be able to beat them. They were more impressive, you know, for Houston, for Indianapolis, for Cincinnati. You know, I think we knew the Jets weren't going to be any good. I think we're pretty sure that we knew the 49ers weren't going to be any good. But, you know, there's some real questions now about these bad teams. I don't know what the Jaguars are, but I know we're going to have to go play them in 2 weeks over in London, and they do look to be a little bit revamped right now in that way that they're going to run the ball. The one thing I'll say about the Ravens is you run the ball on the Ravens, I want to go see it. I mean, it's that looks to be the one part of this Ravens thing that's going to hold up 16 weeks is that the Leonard Fournettes are going to have a hard time against the Ravens.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, you're right. The Jaguars are one of those teams right now where it's hard to get a read after 1 week, whereas, you know, the Ravens, you're pretty certain as to what you're getting. You know that defense is going to be stout, especially up front. They're going to shut down opposing running backs for the most part. They're, you know what you're getting, and I don't think there's any question. No one's saying week one was an aberration for the Ravens, right? I mean, again, it won't happen every week. They're not going to, what's 20 times 16? They're not going to score 320 points and allow 0 this season. But, you know, they're going to be right there at the end of the year. It's pretty clear from week one, and that's no fluke. Whereas, you know, you look at a team like the LA Rams that won 46-9 against the Colts team that's just a complete mess right now. And you look at the Jacksonville Jaguars who won convincingly against the Houston Texans team that was using the wrong quarterback and everyone in the world knew about Bill O'Brien. You look at the Philadelphia Eagles who are a bit of a tough read still. The Buffalo Bills, they beat the Jets. Can't put a lot of stock into that week one victory. So, you know, there are not all week one victories were created equal. And I think the Jags are probably the most interesting of those teams because we know the Rams aren't going to the playoffs. The Bills very likely are not going to the playoffs. But then you look at, you know, again, you look at this one particular team, the Jaguars, and you think, they've got the talent. And we've been saying that for so many years, it feels like a cliche, right? I mean,
yeah, their talent, their potential got Gus Bradley jettisoned, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Doug Marrone came out and said that. I'm paraphrasing, but something along the lines this week of I'm sick of hearing that we're a talented team because essentially that means that we're not a winning team. Otherwise, they'd be saying something other than that. You know, when you say a team is really talented, you're usually making an excuse for the fact that they're not winning. And that's been the Jaguars' problem for so many years, of course. This is the first time they've been over 500 in 3 years, and they're 1-0. So, you know, but you look at it, and you're like, okay, Fournette, that offensive line, you know, that receiving core, even without Allen Robinson, it's not a bad receiving core. It was good, and now it's maybe average without Allen Robinson. And then you look at the defense in all three levels, and Calais Campbell was incredible, and Dante Fowler had the return touchdown, and on the back half, you've got obviously stars as well, and Jalen Ramsey should be in for a huge season.
Well, I mean, all these names you're mentioning were all, you know, spotlight top 10 draft picks. Every April they win the draft, and they've been, you know, defensive, and they've gotten guys hurt on the first day of practice, as you've pointed out. So they've had weird stuff happen. I think we've all been talking about them for 3 years, saying if their players maximize their potential, they should be a team that can win 10 games in that division, which is pretty diminished at this point.
Yeah, and you know, and that's why it's so scary to even say it, because we said it last year, and we said it about the Washington Redskins when they won free agency every single year in the early 2000s, and you know, we've made that mistake so many times about teams that, again, talented, no track record for winning, and that's why it's so scary to say anything like that, to make any definitive statements regarding the Jacksonville Jaguars after a 29-7 victory to start the season against a team that was in the playoffs last year. So, it looks so good on paper, and you really want, I mean, again, we go back to our baseball talk about Toronto fans kind of, regardless of recent spats, cheering for Orioles fans, and maybe vice versa to an extent, and the Indians and all these teams. You want, I think if you're a neutral bystander and not an AFC South fan of one of those other teams, you want the Jaguars to succeed. You really do. I mean, how can you not? You want parity in this league. You want new teams in the playoffs. You want something refreshing, and that would be the epitome of refreshing in the NFL, is to see Jacksonville actually in this thing. I mean, it's been about a decade. It was David Garrard, I think, when they beat Pittsburgh in the playoffs. I think that was 2007. So, I mean, it would be so nice to see that happen, and I think most neutral fans are kind of pulling for that to be the case this year, but I think all of us have some natural trepidation, and that is completely warranted considering the fact that they have continually failed, and despite that talent, and the fact that the one position on the field that is the most important is the one that raises the most concerns, and that is Blake Bortles at the quarterback position.
Big games this week: Green Bay, Atlanta, Dallas, Denver. A couple of pretty interesting, matchups among some teams that think they might be good this year, right?
Yeah, it's going to be week one was kind of perfect in terms of how it looked like it was setting up. The actual games were kind of lackluster for the most part. We didn't have a lot of close games. We had some really, really ugly performances, a lot of penalties, a lot of injuries. It was a little bit sloppy. Now you look at even jumping in, to start the week, Houston and Cincinnati is obviously fantastic because it's two teams that need to bounce back so much. And that's that usually creates a pretty enticing matchup. Obviously, Cleveland, Baltimore, to speak to that market that you're located in. I mean, the Browns, as you mentioned, Deshaun Kaiser gives them hope. That's the term that Hugh Jackson used early this week, and I think he truly does give them a chance to compete a little bit more than their previous quarterbacks do, and they have a little bit more talent around them, and they were right there with Pittsburgh. So that could be very interesting to see how they perform against a Baltimore team that, as we said, looks so good in their week one victory over Cincinnati. So, that's going to be an interesting one. New England, New Orleans, I mean, how do the Patriots bounce back? I mean, they cannot start 0-2, but you're going into the Superdome now to face Drew Brees and the Saints. They're banged up, but that'll be intriguing. That 0-2 start is what everybody fears so much. And, there are, I guess not 16 teams, I guess 15 teams that are facing that based on that week one bye for Miami and Tampa. So 15 teams headed into week two trying to avoid a dismal.
Brad, always a pleasure to have you on. He is Brad Gagnon, national NFL correspondent out there with Bleacher Report, and you can follow his journey from Toronto, Canada, up there in the Great White North at Brad_Gagnon. That's Gagnon. You can find me out in the Bay at Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, and streaming live on our Facebook Live as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. At Greenmount Station on Wednesday night with Ryan Jensen as well as Austin Howard. Come on out, get swabbed, get yourself a crab cake up in Carroll County, beautiful Hampstead. Greenmount Station. Now, I think it's our ninth year doing shows up there, so we're looking forward to that. Always a great group of folks up there. Next Saturday, if you're in London, going to Wembley to see the Ravens play the aforementioned Jaguars, come on out and see us. We'll be in East London at the Fox at XL in the Docklands area. It's a convention area that was built for the Olympics a couple of years ago, so it's a nice area. We have the Emirates Air cable car that goes across the River Thames over to the O2 Arena. It's one of the really cool attractions, and we're hoping that we all do it together on Saturday afternoon at 2:52. So come on out, say hello. You can find me anywhere the internet is served. Facebook, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, anywhere you are. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports